Hi, everyone. My name is Marie Dorini. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Welcome to the SNF Rendez-Vous de l'Institut, the Fellows Series. We're happy to welcome John Phan on stage this evening. John is Assistant Professor of Vietnamese Humanities in the Department of East Asian Languages and Culture at Columbia University. He earned his PhD from Cornell and was a postdoctoral researcher at the National Institute for Japanese Language and Linguistics in Tokyo, among other fellowships, but I'm just going to keep it short. I thought that was pretty cool. John's research focuses on the history of the Chinese and Vietnamese languages. And now I'm going to quote from his CV because this is both very technical and very cool, and I want to get it right. He is an expert in historical linguistics, especially the historical phonology of the Sinitic and Austroasiatic languages families. Is that right? Yeah. With a specialization in Chinese and Vietnamese. His work has also appeared in several linguistic journals, including, and his book, Lost Tongues of the Red River, Annamese Middle Chinese, and the Origins of the Vietnamese Language, is about to come out with Harvard Asia Center Press. What date will it come out?
Hopefully within a year or so on paper.
Okay.
It's done, I swear to God.
We believe you. So tonight, John's going to tell us about Vulgar Experiments, and he's going to help us understand how a language moves from purely oral to written, and what are the consequences on literary expression, and why most cultures made a clear distinction between the vernacular and the written word. As an example, John will focus on 18th century translations from classical Chinese into vernacular Vietnamese, and how these experiments came to define Vietnamese literary modernity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. Before I begin, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Marie, as well as Mark Mazauer, James, Justine, and Contant, and everybody here at the Institute, especially my fellows, because I have never really experienced such a special atmosphere, such an intellectual and creative community. It's like nothing I've ever been a part of before, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to be part of it. And I'm a little heartbroken that the end of the term is coming so soon, so thank you so much. So, yeah, I shouldn't say that. There's plenty of time left. So my project is called Vulgar Experiments, and I'd like to begin with a pair of poems to illustrate the topic. The poem I'm going to show you here is by a poet named Ho Sun Hương. She was writing at the end of the 18th century, at the end of the process that I'll be discussing today. And this poem is written in classical Chinese, and it reads, "Dew like pearls, moon like the gleam of jade, flickering to and fro, radiant on the breast, regret for an old friend, a distant shore, love unrealized, my heart hems and haws. Mossy barrens of the goddess fane, clouds scattering the Chu king's terrace. The bright moon gleams as though in expectation. The one I yearn for, where is he now?" So it's luscious, opulent imagery, reminiscent of what we call palace-style poetry in the Chinese tradition. It's a very classic trope. It's a poem of yearning, nostalgia, love, etc. I'd like you to compare this poem, its tone and its style, with another poem by the same author, written this time, although you might not be able to tell, this is in vernacular Vietnamese. Okay? This poem is called Sharing a Husband, also by Ho Sun Hương. She writes, "One under the quilts, the other in the cold, damn a life sharing a husband. 5 or 10 times would be lovely, but I don't even get it twice a month. I struggle to bear it for the rice, but the rice has gone bad, kept like a maid without wages. If I had known it would be like this, I would have stayed the way I was." Okay. So obviously different in tone, different in tenor, different in theme, but the same poet. Most particularly different in language. This is in the vernacular language. The previous poem was in the classical language. Both written by the same woman, Ho Sun Hương, at the end of the 18th century. So Ho Sun Hương, at the end of the 18th century, expresses a couple things for us. First of all, it shows us that by the end of the 18th century, Vietnamese elites were composing regularly in both classical Chinese and vernacular Vietnamese. And there were often very different styles, tones, content, and choice of genres when writing in the classical versus vernacular Vietnamese. So vernacular Vietnamese literature by this time had become a vibrant avant-garde medium alongside an continuingly robust tradition in classical Chinese. So the question I'd like to begin with, first of all, as you can see from the minimal pair, there are different things happening in this new literature, right? Not just in terms of theme, but in terms of modes of expression. So the question I'd like to ask is, how did this vernacular literary voice develop, and how did the Vietnamese language transform through this process? And what I'd like to point out is that this is actually a global process. It happens not just in Vietnam, but everywhere, over and over and over again. And to formulate the question in broader terms, we could pose it this way. What happens when a spoken language becomes a literary language? And by literary, I mean something specific. I'm not going to talk about the complicated and important topic of oral literary traditions today. By literary language, I mean writing. I mean what happens when a spoken language acquires a script and therefore starts to be used for purposes that were previously kept for a different language in that society. And there's a kind of idea to explain this. And there's this idea, the idea that all you need is a spoken language like French or Vietnamese or Italian, and you can add to it a script, a way of writing it, and a few new words, maybe from the classical tradition, and boom, you get a vernacular literary language, just like that. But I'd like to begin by stating flatly that, of course, this idea, it's inadequate. It does not actually describe what happens. What happens is, in fact, a very complicated process of transformation. There's a reason why people tend to like to think of this idea to explain the vernacular literary language, and I'll get to that at the end. What's missing from this model? The concept of translation. And that's the main thrust of my argument for today. I'm going to argue that translation plays a key role in the development of what we call not only vernacular literary traditions, but in fact, modern literary expression. To quote Walter Benjamin, and I'll quote him many times today because I like him a lot, he's smart, he wrote, "The translator's task consists in this, to find the intention toward language into which the work is to be translated, on the basis of which an echo of the original can be awakened in it." And that brings me to the term that I use for the title of this talk, Vulgar Experiments. Well, what are the vulgar experiments I'm talking about? I'm not talking about, and I apologize if you were looking forward to it, I'm not talking about anything salacious or sexy, although some of it is. I'm talking about vulgar in terms of the vernacular language. And by experiments, I mean taking classical literature, classical Chinese literature, and experimentally transforming it into the vernacular. There's a series of translations that occur over the 17th and 18th centuries, a series of works that are originally composed by Vietnamese authors in classical Chinese, and then decades or sometimes about a century later, translated into the vernacular in an experimental form of literature. And that's what I mean by vulgar experiments. Now, as Marie mentioned, my first book has nothing to do with this topic. I'm actually trained as an historical linguist. My first book is about historical phonology. Please buy it when it comes out. But you don't have to worry about it because it's a completely different project. So just forget about it. This is the new project, okay? And I want to mention that it's new because it is very new. I'm actually still reading through the material. So I have some tentative hypotheses, but really I'm trying to make sense of the observations that I'm making here at the Institute. So also the translations are very raw. So I know several of you are experts in classical, so be kind, but also please help me if you see anything. So what is the tentative hypothesis? Well, I'd like to contend that a purely oral language is not equipped to do the same things as a written literary language, at least not at first. There is a deep mismatch in expressive capacity. A vernacular literary language emerges out of a practice of translation from a classical language into the new written form of the language of daily speech. And this process does two things. First, it transforms virtually every aspect of the spoken language, creating a new literary vernacular out of a process of hybridization with the classical. And second, and this is the more tentative point, it produces, I think, new forms of literary expression through the marriage of classical structures with what I'd argue is the sensual immediacy of the spoken language. That's where the modern part comes in. So in other words, translation, I think, drives the development of a kind of literary modernity. So what is the rest of the talk going to be like? Well, there's 5 little sections. The first section, I'm going to touch on terms cosmopolitan and vernacular. These are words for the linguistic modes that used to describe the spoken language versus the classical language. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context of the Vietnamese case because it's specific. And then I'll turn to the main course of the talk, which are the vulgar experiments themselves. And I'll discuss briefly examples from 2 out of the 7 texts that I'm working on, which show the effects of translation on the development of vernacular language. And then I will return to some tentative conclusions and then end on a coda discussing something I call linguistic nationalism because I can't help myself, it's important. But anyway, there are 5 little sections so you can gauge your strength of attention all the way through. So we'll start with the first point, cosmopolitan versus vernacular. What do we mean by this? Well, this is a way of explaining the coexistence of often a written language with the spoken languages in a single society. So in our world today, we tend to think of spoken languages like English, French, or Vietnamese having very simple one-to-one relationships with their written forms. If you speak English, you write in English. If you speak in French, you write in French. If you speak in Vietnamese, you write in Vietnamese. And that's basically the way it works. And this is the result of early modern European-style nation-state ideology. It was spread around the world through colonialism, and it had real effects on society. It had real effects on how language works. But this is not the way the world worked until that point, even in Europe. So if we go to East Asia before the nation-state, before the 18th century, before the 19th century really, we have, for example, many, many spoken languages, spoken Vietnamese, spoken Japanese, the various spoken Chinese languages, all sharing a written form, a classical form, in this case, classical Chinese. This should be very familiar to you. You can think of Latin and the European vernaculars. You can think of many other examples around the world. The key point here is that the script and the language come together. So if you are in pre-modern Korea, you speak in Korean. I am simplifying, I admit it, but you speak in Korean, but then the mode in which you write is a different language and script, okay? And it has strange effects when interacting with your spoken language because it's such a different language. And that language, the classical language, is the thing that we call the cosmopolitan mode. Why cosmopolitan? Because it travels. It goes all around, right? It's shared by a large area. And that's against the vernacular, which is restricted to a single speaker population. The cosmopolitan is written, that's why it can travel, whereas the vernacular is spoken and therefore restricted to a speaker community. The cosmopolitan often comes to be considered the classical literary language, both for governmental documentation as well as for aesthetic literary expression. And at least until a certain point in social history, the vernacular is considered vulgar, base, or mean, unworthy of composition. That doesn't last, of course, right? And these coexist in a single society. You can think of a billion examples of this. The great examples are the Latin cosmopolis in Western Europe versus all of the European vernaculars. You can think of classical Chinese in East Asia against all the East Asian languages. There's also other cosmopolises like the Sanskrit cosmopolis in South Asia, as well as the Arabic cosmopolis, which continues to today, right? In fact, the Arabic world is a perfect extension of the kind of model I'm describing. And to reformulate the question for today, the question I'm posing is what happens when that vulgar language becomes written, right? What happens to this structure? What happens to that language? And that brings us to the vulgar experiments. As I mentioned, these are a series of translations. And for our case, that means a translation from classical Chinese, the cosmopolitan language, into the vernacular language, which in our case is Vietnamese, okay? So just keep that in mind. I'll probably use the word classical a lot, but I mean this cosmopolitan language versus the vernacular. So now a little bit like a crash course, 2-minute crash course in Vietnamese history. So why is the cosmopolitan versus vernacular situation so common in the world? Well, it's because writing was only invented about 4 times in human history. So one of those times was in ancient China. And ancient Chinese writing and language, what we call roughly classical now, spread all across the continent, as well as into the area of northern Vietnam. And the area of modern northern Vietnam was, in fact, the southernmost territory of what we call the Chinese empires from the Han through Tang dynasty. That's roughly the 2nd century BCE through the 10th century CE. That's over 1,000 years. The entire first millennium, the area of northern Vietnam was the southernmost perimeter of the empire. If you go to the second millennium, quickly, Vietnam does become an independent kingdom. But Vietnamese elites continue to compose in classical Chinese as the cosmopolitan language throughout this entire period up until the 20th century. What's different is that slowly over the second millennium, a script is devised and elites start to write in a limited fashion in vernacular Vietnamese. And you can ignore most of this. This is for my students. But look at the white space on the timeline. In that white space, there were clan wars between two factions in Vietnam, the North and the South, and there was, as a consequence, an educational crisis. And exactly during this time, what we get are the series of vulgar experiments that I'm going to be discussing today. So in the timeline of Vietnamese history, that is where we're spending our time. And that's where something happens to the relationship between classical Chinese and vernacular Vietnamese in its written form. So the last thing I need to give you a little bit of background on is the form in which the vernacular took in terms of writing. And that script is a script called chữ nôm, okay, chữ nôm. Today, Vietnamese is written using a Romanized alphabet. But that is a very recent change. It's also an interesting story, but it's very recent. It actually changed in the first third of the 20th century. Over the second millennium, Vietnamese intellectuals developed a writing system called nôm based on Chinese characters. There it is on the bottom. If you read classical, you can tell that it's not Chinese. If you don't, it might look exactly the same because it works exactly the same, but it's designed to represent syllables and morphemes in the Vietnamese language, right? So that's all you need to know. When I show you the vernacular translations, they're going to take that form. They're going to be written in this script, and I'll just call it nôm moving forward. Okay? So the cosmopolitan is classical Chinese. The vernacular is the Vietnamese language written using this script. Okay? So now let's get to the main course, so I don't take too much of your time. 3 out of 5. We're doing well. So what are the vulgar experiments I'd like to discuss today? Well, these are the texts that I'm focusing on in this project. There are 7 texts. They span the 15th through 19th centuries, but the first and last ones are kind of controls. The core texts are the 4 texts in the middle, and they're all written within about 130, 140 year span. So they're quite rapidly composed. At least the vernacular translations are. And what I'm going to be sharing with you today are just 2 out of those 4 out of those 7. So just the first and the last of the core texts, the hagiography and the ballad. So all of my examples will be drawn from just those 2 texts. So let's start with the hagiography. So the hagiography is titled Recorded Sayings of Native Practices of the Cloud Dharma Buddha of Cầu Châu, or Cầu Châu Pháp Văn Phật Bản Hành Ngữ Lục. It's a long, long name. It's one of 3 related texts. You can think of it just as the hagiography. That's the point, right? You can think of it as one of 3 related texts recording the mythical foundation of the first 4 Buddhist temples in Vietnam. But what it really is a myth that follows the miraculous story of a girl named Aman and the many miracles associated with her and a stone Buddha that she gives birth to. It's a really weird story. It's not Buddhist at all. It's not Confucian at all. It's not Sinitic at all. It's basically feminine divinity and agricultural magic. So it's a really fascinating story. It takes place in the 3rd century CE, but the colophon of the extant version with the Nôm translation has the date of 1752. However, if you look at the structure of the script and the vocabulary, it's very clear that it's older than 1752. It's probably from the early 17th century. That's why I'm treating it as the earliest of these texts, right? So it's before the burst of quote-unquote vulgar experiments. So what are we going to see in the examples I'm going to show you? Well, most importantly, we're going to see something I call classical slippage into an unstable literary vernacular. That is, bits and pieces of the cosmopolitan language slipping into the vernacular translation because the vernacular is not yet stable. And why is that? Because it's weird to write in the vernacular at this time for people. And then I'll show you some examples of culturally specific elaboration in the translation. So here's the first page of the hagiography. You can see my notes from 2002 on the cover. And just to give you a sense of the architecture of how a text like this works, the large font that you see is the original classical Chinese text. And it's always followed line by line with a double column of smaller font vernacular Vietnamese nôm, and that's the translation, right? Okay, so let's take a look. So the first example I want to give you is just a baseline translation to show you that oftentimes it's pretty faithful, the translation. So take, for example, this passage. Quốc nhân văn chi mặc bất khẩm ngưỡng. The king's people heard this and none did not look up in reverence. That's classical Chinese, right? And in the vernacular translation in prose, it reads, Người trong nước màng tiếng đấy, chẳng chẳng ngửa kính. The kingdom's people heard that rumor, none did not look up in reverence. Little differences here and there, basically the same. It's possible. It happens a lot. The reason why I'm showing you this is because having these examples helps us to isolate when there's kind of elaboration, when there's difference. It's a kind of control. So the first kind of interesting example I'd like to show you involves lexical gaps. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the vernacular and the classical have an expressive mismatch. You can say a lot more in the classical than you can in the vernacular, especially when you're trying to write the kinds of stories that are normally written in the classical. Sometimes the word simply does not exist. Not even just the word, but sometimes the concept doesn't exist. And also sometimes even the grammatical structure doesn't exist to express that concept. So this produces gaps in the translation. So the question is, what does the translator do? So in this example, it reads, they made a secret prayer and the dark resonated. Suddenly a great rain fell. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the word for suddenly, hốt nhiên. Hốt nhiên means suddenly, and it is a kind of adverbial structure in late, well, it's not well, we can call it classical, but by this point, it's an adverbial structure, okay? And that adverbial structure is a word plus the suffix nhiên. But that structure does not exist in classical. I'm sorry, in the vernacular. In fact, there is no easy way to say suddenly, as weird as it sounds. There's no way to say suddenly in the vernacular at this time. There's a way to express that meaning, but it takes a very different path, okay? So what does the author try to do when he's confronted with this very useful, concise, dense way of saying suddenly in the classical? Well, in this case, he tries to calque it in a very clumsy way. So, So what he does is he translates suddenly with a very clumsy compound, which is minute, second, just like that, okay? So that is not the way. There's an easier way to say suddenly in the vernacular, but it's very distant from the classical way. So in this case, the translator is trying to bring the classical structure into the vernacular, and he's kind of failing. It doesn't really make sense when you read the vernacular, okay? And we're going to see a different solution to this kind of problem later on. I want to show you this one first, because this is the early stage when the translator still doesn't know what to do in the vernacular language. And you can see that he's thinking in the classical. That's the main point. Okay. The second point I want to show you in this example is the word for great rain. The word for great rain is dai vu, da yu in Mandarin. And that is translated as great rain in Vietnamese, but the key point here is another grammatical point. In classical Chinese, the adjective precedes the noun, but in Vietnamese, like in French, the noun precedes the adjective. It's the opposite, right? So what's interesting about this case is that the translator has translated the substance words. They have not used the words dai and vu in the translation. They've used the word ca, which means great, and mưa, which means rain, in vernacular Vietnamese. But they preserved the classical Chinese word order. It's a kind of scrambling. Why? Because, again, they're thinking in the classical, and they're not sure what to do in the vernacular, right? Okay. So another kind of cosmopolitan slippage is a very common one, which just involves lexical borrowing. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but in this case, the word for quarter in red, phường, is just borrowed wholesale into the vernacular. I just want to show you one example because that happens a lot. It happens in every case of this type of social structure. That's how we get so many Chinese words into modern Vietnamese. That's how we got so many French words into English, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But more interestingly than that example in this is the case of whole phrases slipping into the vernacular. So if you look at the top, the classical reads, coming to the 4 statues, they were distributed amongst the quarters, this is of the city, for the creation and establishment of, and then the next line reads, Thiên Định, which is the name of the first of the 4 temples. Okay, so that's the original. In the Vietnamese, the first phrase before the slash, Đến 4 tượng chia phường dựng làm chùa. That reads, coming to the 4 statues, they were shared amongst the quarters and established for the creation of the temples. It's pretty good. It's pretty faithful. It's in vernacular Vietnamese. And then we have this totally different line. In the Lý Dynasty, Thiên Định Temple was changed to Dien Ung Temple. Now that's interesting for 2 reasons. One, that information is not anywhere in the original. It's just a kind of commentarial, explanatory insertion that is inserted into the translation portion of the page. So we can see that there is other than thinking in the classical, the translator is also thinking in a way that is meant to explain or contextualize the classical. That's another thing that they're doing as a translator. But the other interesting thing about this second phrase, some of you probably have already noticed, is that it's actually in classical Chinese. It's not in the vernacular. So in that task, they're writing in they're writing in Vietnamese, but then the vernacular has slipped in not just a word or a phrase, a word or a comma, but an entire phrase. And this happens surprisingly a lot in the translation. Over and over again, we see, even in the same sentence, a vernacular Vietnamese phrase followed by a Chinese phrase, mixed and matched, hybridized here and there. We can see it over and over again. And again, this shows us that they're thinking in classical and they're struggling to compose in the vernacular. Okay? There's another really interesting thing structurally that happens with the development of a grammatical particle called jung. It's so interesting, but I'm not going to talk about it today. But I hope you ask about it because it's actually the most interesting example, but it's very technical. So forget about it. But this, as well as the other two examples that I've shown you, all show structural interference from the cosmopolitan into the vernacular language in the practice of translation. Now, in the last two examples I want to show you from this text, I want to show you the opposite, some things that are happening in an elaborative way in the vernacular part, particularly specifying imagery. And this is a kind of foreshadowing of what we're really going to see in the second text. Okay? So if you take a look at this example, heard from within the tree, hiddenly there was the sound of music, is the original, the classical. I apologize for the translationese, but I'm trying to show you something specific. Again, we have one of those adverbial structures that are really hard to translate into Vietnamese, at least at this time. The word hiddenly, just like suddenly, right? Hốt nhiên was suddenly, ẩn nhiên is hiddenly. And that is hard to translate. As we saw last time, it was very clunky, but here they're hitting on a solution that's going to become dominant in the future. And that is using a special class of word called tử lấy, which is a sense onomatopoeia. And it's very common actually in classical Chinese, but it's especially common in vernacular Vietnamese. And it will become the hit-upon solution to translate difficult adverbial information that is rich in imagery from the classical into the vernacular. So in this case, instead of saying hiddenly in some awkward way, they say vang vang, which means echoingly or faintly or from a great distance, right? It's a very evocative way to translate the word an yin. Okay? So that's the first thing I want to show you. And the second thing I want to show you in this example is the word amnyak. The sound of music in the original is translated as the sounds of a lute and the sound of singing. Obviously very different. So in both cases, we have established the directionality of elaboration, which we're going to see a lot of examples of next. And that is, it's always in the direction of more concrete, emotional, more concrete, physical, sensual, and ultimately emotional or psychological imagery. It's always vaguer in the original, or perhaps an illusion, and then it becomes more concrete or immediate in the vernacular. And that is a very strong finding. It's very regular. It never goes the other way. Okay? So, there is one more example. I couldn't resist. This is really interesting, though. But then we'll go on to the next text. So in this example, there's also in this text examples where the information is tweaked to cater to the vernacular audience. I just wanted to show you this because it's interesting. This is a sentence where a great man is worshipped as a worthy after his death. It's a very Confucian way of, sort of immortalizing a great figure. But in the vernacular, it just says he was trusted and worshipped as a latter worthy. So to give you a sense of the word worthy, Confucius was a worthy. Okay, so that's the type of thing we're talking about. But in the vernacular, he's not only worshipped as a worthy, but then they add another sentence. He resonated with the power of the Buddha as well as the power of the mother. Again, nowhere to be found in the original. And this is a kind of culture editorializing that shows us the audience of the vernacular translation. The vernacular translation is probably the script for proselytization to illiterate people. Right? So in other words, you've got a very oblique text that you need to make appealing to the Buddhist masses who are going to be falling asleep during the homily. I just mixed religions, but you understand what I'm saying. And they don't care about Confucian worthies. They care about the Buddha. So you make him also worshipped as a Buddha. And they care about this other thing, which is the mother, which is a religious practice known as the cult of the Heavenly Mother. It's a very powerful religion in pre-modern Vietnam that worships 4 palaces of basically goddesses that divide up the cosmology of the universe. And it's very prevalent even today. It's completely unsemitic. And you can see very strikingly, it's inserted into this otherwise very patriarchal Semitic text to cater to ostensibly the vernacular audience. That one doesn't really have to do with our topic, but I thought it was interesting, so I kept it in. Anyway, what are the takeaways of the hagiography? So we can move on to finish the talk. Well, classical Chinese was the default linguistic mode for literary composition. That's the main finding here. They're thinking in classical. When you write in classical. That's the prevailing mode. And therefore, classical words and grammar regularly slipped into an unstable written vernacular. The written vernacular was taking shape at this time. And as a result, not as a result, but this you can describe as a kind of literary code switching. Just like we code switch when we speak more, almost everyone here speaks more than one language, right? So when you move between one language and another, you drag little bits of one language into the other. That's what's happening in the translation. But the key here is that the written vernacular is not stable yet, and therefore, the vernacular language changes structurally as a result of this process. The vernacular also facilitates cultural and linguistic commentary on the classical as well, as we saw at the end. Okay? So those are the takeaways from the first text. There's only one more text and only a few more examples. But before that, I'd like to return to Walter Benjamin for a moment. So Walter Benjamin quotes Rudolf Panwitz. I can't read the original because it's in German, and I don't speak German, unfortunately. I really want to learn German. But he quotes Rudolf Panwitz as writing, "The fundamental error of the translator is that he holds fast to the state in which his own language happens to be, rather than allowing it to be put powerfully in movement by the foreign language." Now, what I'd like to suggest is that that is in fact not a problem in this early time because the written vernacular is not stable. Therefore, there is no standard to which to hold the vernacular language. And therefore, it is freely transforming as a result of the practice of experimenting with the translation from the classical into the vernacular. So now let's move about 150 years later to the ballad, which has a more sort of mature version of vernacular translation. So the ballad is named The Ballad of a Soldier's Wife, Tsing Phu Ngam Khúc, and it was originally composed in classical Chinese by a Vietnamese elite named Dang Trần Quon in the mid-18th century, and it was translated at least twice into Nom over the following about 50 years. And the most enduring translation is attributed to a woman named Doan Thi Diem, who is the most famous female writer of the 18th century. And her translation takes the form of a poem, a poetic meter called 7768, which is crucial to the finding I'm going to share with you. So I will explain it a little bit before the examples. The content describes the trials of a woman separated from her husband in a time of war. It's like the first 30 pages is just the husband and wife glancing back at each other over and over and over again. It's actually, it's not a very exciting, I shouldn't say that, it's beautiful. Okay. So what are we going to see in the text? So we're going to see first aesthetic elaboration facilitated by this uneven poetic meter, 7768, Sam Thất Lục Bát in Vietnamese. And then we're going to see, this is hard to explain, it's part of the thing that I'm trying to think through, a kind of moving target with regard to what is latched onto as the object of translation. And that's what I think is the interesting point. So this image I started the talk with is in fact a 19th century cover to one edition of the text. And the image I've shown you before here is the inside of a different edition of that text, just to show you the architecture. The top is classical Chinese, the bottom is the vernacular Vietnamese translation. Okay? A quick word about the meter before I give you the examples. It's called 7768, and that describes a quatrain, 2 couplets. So the first couplet is exactly what it sounds like. It's 2 lines of 7 syllables each. And the second couplet is 2 lines of uneven length, a 6-syllable line and an 8-syllable line. The thing to realize about this is that 2 lines of equal length and an odd number of syllables is an excellent structure to translate classical Chinese. A lot of classical Chinese structure is either 5 or 7 syllables in length, and they're almost always, at least what we call regulated structure, is always even numbers of lines. So that's going to be fairly easy, but 6-8, even number of syllables and an uneven number of syllables in the couplet, that's going to be very hard with regard to translating the content from the original. So and also the other weird thing about this structure is that the meter and feeling of the first couplet is super different than the second couplet. So I'm just going to read you the first lines of the poem to give you a sense of the sound. So the first lines of the ballad read as follows. Thuở trời đất nổi cơn gió bụi, khách má hồng nhiều nỗi chuyên chiên. Okay? And then 6-8, much more comfortable for the Vietnamese language. Xanh kia thăm thẳm chừng trên, vì ai gây dựng cho nên nỗi này. It's beautiful, right? Okay, so what I want to point out is that something is going to happen with that second couplet. So each of the examples we're going to see, we're going to be looking at the bottom half of the quatrain. Okay? So here's the first example, again, a kind of baseline, clunky but faithful. In all of these examples, the classical is on the top and the vernacular is on the bottom, highlighted in yellow. So the classical reads, my lord glances back towards his wife. Xianyang is a historical allusion to a place. The wife glances back towards her lord, Xiaoxiang. The vapors of Xiaoxiang block the trees of Xianyang. The trees of Xianyang cut off the Xiang River. Okay? It's one of these very laborious, allusion-heavy quatrains in this poem. Now that is translated as, at Xianyang, my lord still glances back. In the realm of Xiaoxiang, I still gaze after my lord. The vapors of Xiaoxiang cut off Xianyang. The trees of Xianyang cut off Xiaoxiang, several layers. Okay? So it's essentially the same, but the point is that damn 8-syllable line. You need to fill it out somehow. And so the translator, she fills it out with this tiny little phrase, 美中, several layers distant. Okay? Now this is a mild example, and it's doing two things. One, it shows you that faithful translation is absolutely possible, okay, to a certain extent, but it's troubled by the 6/8 couplet. And two, it's showing us that allusions are not a problem for the translator, okay? She always has the option of just importing the allusion, okay? That's important. So now let's look at the more interesting examples where we see aesthetic elaboration in the translation. The first kind of aesthetic elaboration I want to show you involves allusions, a process called I use the word de-allusioning. It's not a real word, but it means stripping away the classical allusion in the original. Okay, so in this case, in the first line reads, departing, well, it should be more like left behind, the sound of falling plums, okay, gradually fades. Falling plums it's a stand-in for the wife, but it is an allusion to a song, a classical allusion to a classical song. And that is turned into the sounds of the piping flute are heard echoing. In both the classical and the vernacular, it is a stand-in for the wife. But what's interesting is, again, we see the translation of an allusion into concrete imagery, the sounds of a piping flute. More interestingly, the song is famously a flute song. So the translator knew, she understood the allusion, and she decided to reject it for a concrete image, but then retained something faithful to the original by making it the sound of a piping flute. It's a very interesting choice, okay? The second thing I want to show you is, again, increasingly the use of that special class of words, tử lấy, sense onomatopoeia, to translate things that are difficult from the classical. There are two examples here. Fading away gradually, or gradually becoming distant, is translated as dam vang, which is a sense onomatopoeia, again, for echoing, right? And my favorite in this example, the verb troubles, mang, what troubles the color of the soldiers' banners, what makes them ripple, that's translated as fitful shadows. Bam fatfa. Fatfa means fitful, like the flickering of a flame, right? That's fitful. So it's a beautiful, very creative way of translating the verb trouble by showing us the kind of fitful fluttering of the shadow of the military pennants as the army is marching away. So those are two examples of elaboration, but what I want to show you is, where does the real elaboration happen? It happens in the last couplet, in the 6/8 couplet. So what reads as, gazing on clouds departing, the Lord takes leave of his wife. Gazing upon the mountains returning, the wife remembers her Lord. Very straightforward parallel structure. Turns into, my Lord's tracks follow a cloud-given path. I peer upon the mountain range, numb with grief. Okay. So I want to point out a couple things. One, the first couplet is very faithful, okay? The second couplet is where we get the departure. And again, my hypothesis is that it's being driven by this 6/8 meter that is uncomfortable for classical, but is very natural for vernacular Vietnamese. And again, the third point is the elaboration is in one direction. It's from vague to precise, right? The sort of unspecific, the husband looks at his wife, the wife looks at his husband, turns into the actual tracks, the actual husband is following a path up into the mountains that are covered with clouds. And now we not only get concrete visual imagery, but emotional imagery as well. The wife is not only gazing at her husband, but she's stunned with the grief of her house, right? She's kind of literally shocked with what her family is going through, okay? And there are lots of examples of this. It happens all over the poem, always in the last couplet. In this case, the one who returns, he who goes, both glance back. I told you they glance at each other like a million times in this poem. The clouds are azure, the mountains verdant. It's beautiful, but that turns into, we glance back upon each other, but are already far apart. The rushing colors of jade clouds spread, staining the mountains green, right? Totally different, and again, facilitated by that 6/8 couplet. And again, in the direction of visual, sensual, emotional specificity. All right, before I give you the last example for today, I'd like to return to Benjamin for a moment. He wrote, unlike a literary work, a translation does not find itself, so to speak, in middle of the high forest of the language itself. Instead, from outside it, facing it, and without entering it, the translation calls to the original within at that one point where the echo in its own language can produce a reverberation of the foreign language's work. That's a little bit long, but I think it's a beautiful image, the idea that the translator is looking at the point in which one language echoes the other. Right? They're looking for something in the original that then moves them, and then that's what they're latching onto. So what I'd like to suggest in this last one is the echo point, so to speak, the point that reverberates. It's moving away from what Benjamin would call the actual semantic meaning of the text. So instead of trying to translate the actual meaning of a given linguistic structure, a given sentence, they're latching onto something else because of the nature of the vernacular language. So this is the last example I'm going to share with you. It also involves an allusion. In this case, another song. So it reads in the classical, we turn back but do not glimpse each other. They're still looking at each other. Green, green, the mulberry path, mulberry path, mulberry path. My intent, my Lord's heart, which is more enduring. So this mulberry path, literally the mulberries on top of the path, is the name of another classical song. It describes a woman who is picking mulberries on the path while her husband's away at work. A prince comes along, wants to seduce her, but of course she remains steadfast. So it's a perfect thematic allusion to make in the construction of this song, which is about the same thing, right? But look at the vernacular. We both look back, but see not each other, seeing only the green, green. The green, green is kept, right? The green, green of thousands of mulberries. 1,000 mulberries dimmed to a single color. My Lord's heart, my soul, whose is more grieved. What's fascinating is that, like we saw before, the illusion is ditched. But unlike what we saw before, she doesn't strive to maintain the meaning of the illusion, which is a steadfast woman. Right? Instead, she latches on to some visual imagery of the song itself and transforms a classical allusion to a steadfast wife into the image of thousands of mulberry trees, so many trees that they all dim to a single color, like looking way out into the horizon, to the distant horizon. And that then becomes an image not of steadfastness, but of the separation of the wife and her husband. So the meaning that she's latched onto to translate has moved. Right? And it's moved again, surprisingly, not surprisingly, hopefully, in the direction of sensual, visual, emotional, and ultimately psychological specificity. So almost the last quote from Walter Benjamin. I'm wrapping up now. I know I'm already gone over I'm longer than the first time I did this. To set free in his own language the pure language spellbound in the foreign language, to liberate the language imprisoned in the work by rewriting it is the translator's task. To this end, the translator breaks through the rotten barriers of his own language. Okay, so first of all, I think rotten barriers is a little inflammatory. We don't need to pay attention to that particular word choice. But I do think what Benjamin is describing here is exactly what's happening in both the hagiography and this text. The translators are breaking through the norms of the vernacular language in the task of translating from the classical. They're creating a new language. Okay? So what are the takeaways from the ballad? Faithful translation was possible in the written vernacular, and the written vernacular was now in a stable form. There's no more code switching anymore, 150 years later. Vernacular sense onomatopoeia increasingly are used to translate these difficult adverbial structures in evocative ways, and most powerfully, the 7/7/6/8 meter facilitated elaboration in the second half of each quatrain, and the direction of elaboration is always the same, towards a sensual, emotional, and/or psychological concreteness. And this may have something to do with the fact that the vernacular is indeed the language of daily use. I think that's reasonable to suggest. Finally, we see a redirection of what is translated towards sensual evocativeness while preserving the themes of the original. So what are the tentative conclusions? Okay. Well, uncontroversially, I'd like to argue that classical Chinese was imagined as the natural medium of written expression all the way through this period. Okay? If you're in the field, you know that, you accept that. However, the literary space, once you could write the vernacular, it blurred the structural lines between classical Chinese and vernacular Vietnamese. And vernacular literary structure was unstable in the beginning. Therefore, it transformed as a result of the task of translating the cosmopolitan and the initial mismatch of expressive quality. This process also drove the production of new modes of expression. Okay? Last quote from Benjamin. Just as fragments of a vessel, in order to be fitted together, must correspond to each other in the tiniest details, but need not resemble each other, so translation, instead of making itself resemble the meaning of the original, must lovingly and in detail fashion in its own language a counterpart to the original's mode of intention, in order to make both of them recognizable as fragments of vessel, as fragments of a greater language. Okay. So what Walter Benjamin was describing in that quote, is a beautiful quote, is he was imagining a drive towards a kind of perfect divine language, what he called the real language. It was a kind of healing of the Tower of Babel curse for Benjamin, writing in his time. But what if, instead of a pure or divine language, translation drives the evolution of literary voice and genre instead? These experiments show that the effect of translation was to stimulate an evolution in the target of translation, the thing that Benjamin called spellbound in the original. The resulting aesthetic elaboration produced a more sensually rich, psychologically immediate literary voice. Those are the keys. Sensually rich, psychologically immediate. For those of you in literature, that should remind you of something. It should remind you of modern literature. And that's the thrust. That's the last part of the hypothesis. This is not just borrowing from the cosmopolitan. It is the creation of something new out of translation. Benjamin differentiates in his famous article between the semantic object of a given word and the mode of intention. This is the passage where he talks about, I can't speak German, but Brot and Phan, the words for bread. He says they mean the same thing, but the mode of attention, the context is different, right? So what I'd like to suggest is the cosmopolitan and vernacular are in many ways two different systems of modes of intention. When translating from one to the other, they don't match up any more than the actual grammatical structures do. But in the act of translation, something in the literature moves, changes, evolves, and emerges. It's the marriage of the cosmopolitan and vernacular that specifically produces a sensual, emotional, and psychological richness in direct, specific form. And that is a kind of literary modernity. That is what I'm arguing is the result of the act of translation. So I know that's very abstract, so I just want to show you a picture to show you what I mean, and then I'm basically done. So we tend to think of Chinese, classical Chinese, as having grammar, vocabulary, phonology, genre, style, and expression, and Vietnamese as having those same things as well, separate and distinct from one another. But as I've discussed, in the realm of early writing collapsed those two worlds, right? And transiting from one to the other did something very specific. What I'm trying to suggest is that the engine of transiting from the cosmopolitan into the vernacular did the following. It hybridized grammar. It hybridized vocabulary. True, it did not hybridize phonology. We speak within the Vietnamese phonology, but as a result of these hybridizations, literary genre itself was hybridized. And the new genres produced a new kind of style and ultimately a new kind of expression. In other words, the engine of translation is driving the production of a new literary vernacular, okay? A modern literature, essentially. So that's the main message I'd like to share with you. And I know I've spoken too long today, but I do beg one more minute because I have to say something about linguistic nationalism. Okay? This is the ghost that haunts this topic. It's only 2 slides, very fast. So when we think about the history of vernacular literatures, I also have to do this because I promised I would. So it's only going to take like 1 minute. When we think about the development of vernacular literature, we often think about it in terms of the vernacular as breaking free of something. Italian broke free of Latin. French broke free of Latin, right? Vietnamese broke free of classical Chinese. But I think it's time for us to let go of that model, okay? It's problematic. You might have been wondering, well, in all the literature that he's talking about, is it Chinese or is it Vietnamese, right? Well, what I'd like to say is classical Chinese was the native literary language of Vietnam. Classical Chinese is literary Vietnamese, okay? So it's a modern nationalist identity that is forcing you to say this is Chinese or Vietnamese. It's Vietnamese, right? And more than that, what we think of as Vietnamese didn't exist back then, even as recently as 100 years ago. Okay? And the Vietnamese literary vernacular was born via translation from the classical. It did not exist before that process. That's the whole point of this presentation. We tend to enshrine literary vernaculars as heroic moments of the national language, expressing the spirit of the nation. You can think of Dante. you can think of many, many French writers. Okay? Right? And that, of course, is the product of modern nation-state ideology. This is ahistorical. This is not a story of Vietnamese breaking free from a constraining tradition of classical Chinese, because again, classical Chinese is Vietnamese. It's a story instead of the emergence of a literary modernity through the alchemy of translation between two native modes of expression. Okay? And I'd like to end now, finally, for real, as I began, with a poem by Ho Sun Huang, because she, as you can tell, is one of my favorite poets, but also she really expresses the ripening of the process I've been describing, the production of a new and modern literary voice that is replete with sensual, psychological, and visual specificity. This is a poem by her, late 18th century, called Confession, and it's written in vernacular Vietnamese. She writes, "A cock's crow echoes above the hutch. Bitter, I gaze out on every thicket. The wretched drum unstruck, yet still it rattles. The mournful bell never rung. Why does it toll? At first listening, these sounds deepen my sorrow. Then fury for a fate left to rot. Talented sons, learned men, is anyone there? This body is already ravaged by brittle age." So it's a little bit of a downer to end the presentation on, but it expresses everything I've been saying about the emergence of that visual specificity, that psychological immediacy, the directness of the subject, that I believe is the product of this series of experiments over the 18th century. Thank you very much.
John, that was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much. I have 60 million questions, but I will save some for tomorrow. So I guess I'll just pose 3 as quickly as I can, and you can choose to answer whatever you want, and we can talk tomorrow. One thing I noticed is that in the Vietnamese translations, one thing that seems to be happening is that while classical Chinese is granted a history and there's some additional historical contextualization, there's a refusal of an oral tradition in classical Chinese, right? The songs become generic songs, right? It was a flute piping rather than the proper name of the song, the title of the song. So it's as if there's a refusal of an oral tradition or a musical tradition. And I'm curious about that dynamic, if it's a kind of rewriting of literary history through that gesture, or if that text is an isolated case. The second question is about, I'm really fascinated by the fact that the Chinese and the Vietnamese always appear together on the page. So one obvious question is, why would you produce an edition like that? Why would you bother? I mean, if you can read Chinese, then read Chinese. Why keep the 2 languages together like that? Right? Bilingual editions today are thought of as teaching tools. So I'm curious about that. And then finally, I'm really intrigued by this ballad. And this is a little out there as an idea, but I'm interested in reading the ballad as proposing a kind of meta trope for the dynamic that you're describing in this glancing of lovers at each other continuously, in this glancing that never ends. It seems to me to emblematize the dynamic you're describing between Chinese and Vietnamese. And I was also struck by the fact that in the Chinese, there are all these examples of chiastic structures where one word appears at the end of the line and then at the beginning of the next. So these chiastic structures are very self-enclosed and self-contained, whereas the Vietnamese seems more open. So I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Yeah.
But
Thank you so much, Eliza. Those are 3 really great questions. So the first question about the refusal of an oral history, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that in the vernacular translation, the vernacular is refusing to award an orality to the classical. Yeah. And that's an interesting thought. So first of all, I would say there are definitely other cases where the title of the song is directly imported. So I think I see the idea that you're chasing, like reserving the oral space for the vernacular. But so I think 2 things as a result, and this is something I haven't thought about, so take this with a grain of salt. A, we do see cases, as I said, where song is referenced in the vernacular, so there is definitely an orality to that. B, the very format of the original classical is what's called a zi. It's a lyric, which is the lyric to a song. So the definition of the classical, it would have been sung to a tune. So by definition, it has an orality to it. But I do think that there is a little bit of there are sometimes a playing with a complementary distribution of worlds, of literary worlds in the vernacular and the cosmopolitan. But I don't think it's that, the line is not drawn that fiercely. So the question about whether, why classical and vernacular appears together, that's a great question. So the first answer is, historically vernacular was absolutely used simply to learn the classical, right? And that is something that we see over and over again throughout history. So these endeavors, especially the early ones, the Buddhist hagiography and the sutras, the vernaculars were written sort of as studies of the classical. So you would use that exact, if you were a monk, you would use that exact text to study the classical sutra, right? So that is, and it's useful, therefore, to have it on the page. The other thing I would say when you get to the 18th and 19th century is that even at this time when people are having fun writing in the vulgar, the proper language is still classical, right? So you're already elevating the vernacular form by sticking the classical on top of it. That said, there are absolutely many, many forms of the classical that don't have the vernacular on it, right? Like, you know, so that happens all the time, you know. That is in fact the default, that's the common form. So the third question is really interesting about the ballad. So there's two parts. The question about the chiastic structure is great, and I think there's a simple answer, and that is that again, this is a lyric form of poetry. So you saw the semicolons. So it's like blah 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 blah, Mulberry Path, Mulberry Path, Mulberry. So the caesura, it's a caesura in the meter of the lyric, and it's following the tune. So the reason why you get that chiastic structure is because that is following whatever the tune is. And of course, the vernacular is not a song the way the lyric is. It's chanted. So it's chanted, but there's no tune to it. There's no set tune, rather. There is a kind of tune, but it's not set. So it is freer. You're picking up on something true. It's closed in terms of its meter, but it's free in terms of its structure like that. Whether the wife and her husband are a kind of meta expression of classical Chinese and Vietnamese, I really like that idea. I wonder what the war is in that analogy that's separating them. But it is a nice idea, you know, and I think there's no way to explore it unless we discovered further writings by Duan Diem, you know, reflecting on the translation. But I will say we do know that she did not like the original poem at first. She read it and she criticized it. And then she reread it and she was like, well, actually, it's kind of interesting, and then she translated it. So there is maybe more to discover in terms of the thing that drew her to the poem. So thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I have a question. You kept referring to the Vietnamese text translations as sensual, while you seem to have taken out the sensuality from the Chinese classical. And I'm wondering, then what kind of sensual in reference to the classical? If we have a different type of sensuality, the sensuality that doesn't come into the classical Chinese. And with that, so the question would be, because you're explaining to us of a vernacular and language embedded in the everyday, and with, if I understood you correctly, illiteracy also part of it, or at least illiteracy being and not writing, just oral. And if there's anything else that has to do with class and different aesthetics that put that different sensual.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think maybe when I used the word sensual, the first thing I meant was that the texts, because I have 7 texts, and there's 4 that are more important than the other 2. They're central in a totally different sense, in that they're the ones who are composed over this long 18th century, so to speak. But I if I'm hearing you correctly, you're posing a really important question about the center versus the margins of the literary world, you know, and a kind of, you can really call it kind of queerness. Vernacular is queer. I mean, it is a queering of the literary space. And I hope you noticed that, like, I didn't talk about the dictionary. There's another text that I was originally going to talk about that was a dictionary. That is composed by a woman. The ballad is composed by a woman. Ho Shun Hung herself is a woman. It's not a coincidence that so many of these writers are women. And there is certainly, I mean, Neo-Confucian, this is the Neo-Confucian time in Vietnam. The Neo-Confucian society is absolutely patriarchal and in a legislated way. So you are actually legally forbidden from learning the classical. And there are loopholes, like if you're a courtesan, you do have to learn it because you have to be good company, but you're barred from learning it properly, right? So that is true. And the space that opened up for curious, intellectually curious women was the Buddhist temple, because Buddhism at this time was suppressed by the central court because the central court was now properly Neo-Confucian. So a lot of these texts are not only written by women, but they're written by women who are taking refuge in the Buddhist court, and they're also published, they're carved and printed by the Buddhist temple, as opposed to, that's why, for example, the hagiography is so ugly. I mean, if you looked at the carving and you know about xylography, you should be like, that's a very ugly carving, because it was a low budget text, you know. But these low budget texts then get recarved multiple times and they become popular. So I think that you're right, there is a kind of something coming from the edge with the vernacular that then invades the mainstream. It's a vulgar experiment, but it's an exciting experiment, right? And that is the story we have with vernacularization over and over and over and over again in every context. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, John. Excuse me. I was very interested in your closing remarks about linguistic nationalism, and the way you situated the story that you told in the context of the stories we tell today about vernacular languages in the context of the modern nation state.
Yeah.
My field is classical philology, Latin and Greek, where we are all sort of imprisoned in the cosmopolis, and we see, as you were saying earlier in your talk, the idea of the vernacular as being somehow kind of debased, right? So the story you told about languages was one in which the process of developing the vernacular literary language enriches, translation enriches the language, right? How would you situate this story in the context of philological, if you like, chauvinism? The idea that something is always lost in translation, that vernaculars can never capture the essence or the totality of the classical. You see what I'm getting at?
This is a fascinating question, especially from the sinological perspective, because like classical philology in East Asia is all about that. So there is this anxiety in East Asia of a loss of access to the classics, because what are called the classics in the context of East Asia is a body of literature that was supposedly written over the Zhou dynasty in the first millennium BC, and that writing is considered to be the perfect expression of the warp and weft of the universe. It is an expression of the pattern of the universe. Therefore, if we lose access to the precise meaning of those texts, we're losing access to divine knowledge. That's the idea, right? So yes, if you go all the way through history, my specialization in this period was in the early medieval period. So you have philologists like Lu Deming, who are, what they're saying is, okay, language is diversifying and people are arguing over how to pronounce this character, and therefore we don't understand what Confucius was saying anymore. Therefore, the empire was divided, right? That's why China got conquered, right? That's the logic. And you go all the way to the Qing dynasty, and the same thing is happening with the great exegetes, the great sort of classicists of the Qing dynasty who are experts at this case. And I think that you're right to say that there are two different processes going on. Because I think the process of philology, in this case, what we see is it engenders a real scientificization, a scientification of knowledge, right? It produces a history of an epistemological history of how to understand language, how to understand texts. It produces historical linguistics and ultimately modern linguistics in the West, right? But that is different than the evolution of literature and expression. And I think what I'm describing in this case is a totally separate process by which the intellectual procedure of rendering language A and language B makes you contemplate the thing that you're translating and therefore produces new categories of meaning. And that's what's driving the development of literary genre. So I would separate those two quite distinctly as intellectual processes. But it's very interesting.
Thank you, John. That was really fascinating. I'm afraid my question might sound a little naive because I'm not a philologist or a literary specialist. So if I think I'm following your talk, you're arguing that the written vernacular originates from attempts to translate the classical into a vernacular in a written form, right? And it's fascinating how you show the direction, right, and the inventiveness and towards the more specific, more emotional, et cetera, et cetera. The poem that you use in the end, that's not a translation, right?
That's not a translation, that's right.
She's writing that in the vernacular herself.
Exactly.
So how does that, can you discuss that leap? Because
Yes.
you're talking about the creation of the literary vernacular through translation.
Yes.
But then the literary vernacular is itself, becomes its own thing.
Yeah, I
Right,
think-
and it's no longer translating. The translating is the experiment that creates it, right? But is there some leap then to people? Then they're starting to write in the vernacular. They're not translating anymore.
Yeah, that's an
Right?
excellent.
And so, what is that leap? And are there things that follow through from these experiments from translation?
It's an excellent question, and it's another one of those questions I haven't thought enough about. But you're absolutely right. But one of the things, if you just look at the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, that is one of the striking things. All of a sudden, by the 18th and 19th centuries, people are directly composing in the vernacular. They are sort of doing. There are earlier examples of this in Vietnamese literature, but they're quite contested. So the real thrust is happening at this point. And if I would hazard an answer, I think there are maybe two ingredients to that transition. One is exactly the product of these vulgar experiments. The vernacular literary voice has been produced. I mean, it's not static, but through these experiments, through these translations, writers have discovered the vernacular literary as a medium. And so they're having fun with it, they're exploring it, they're vindicating it through these elaborated translations. And therefore, it becomes licensed, so to speak, to write in the vernacular. There is one of the texts I work on is a dictionary from 1641. And in that dictionary, there are two prefaces, one in classical and one is in vernacular. And there's a very direct sort of defense of basically, don't be embarrassed, you can write in the vernacular now. And it's right at the onset of this 18th century burst. So I think that's part of it. It's actually, in fact, what happens in this series of experiments. And I do think also, this is something I don't know as much about, but this might be the more sociological answer, and that is that a couple famous writers wrote things that were well received. And the two that I can quote immediately are both women. Duat Diem, who wrote The Ballad, she was well received in her lifetime, and the second poet is Ho Shun Hum, a few decades later, and who is lionized even within her own lifetime. So when you get a writer who writes in a new form, but then it is really well received, then all of a sudden that form and that genre explodes. So I think that goes a long way to explain why by the 19th century, we get things like The Tale of Q, if you know what that is. It's the famous national poem in Vietnam. We get a burst of writing in the vernacular. But I have to say, I really don't know. I have no idea. That's a total guess. But
Well, you're suggesting that it's the form. The form is what emerges and what travels. And it might change, but not fundamentally.
Well, I think the form does have to come first, because if you might be doing things in the vernacular here or there, but it's only reaching a limited sort of, space. And it's through a kind of hybridization with the cosmopolitan that all of a sudden it attains a kind of difference. It's like my favorite comparison is like the history of hip hop. Hip hop was so specific and it was so vernacular. And then over the 70s and 80s, it just exploded because it became hybridized with other forms of pop. You could use the word elevated, but that's not really the right word. It got hybridized. And it became mainstream as a result. And by the 90s, we have the age of hip hop, as the result. And I think in a lot of ways, vernacular is like hip hop, and it's through a kind of hybridization that the form changes, the audience changes, and then it kind of explodes.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the idea that the formalization in language enriches. I mean, the formalization enriches rather than, cabins or does exactly the opposite. So I'm coming from law, of course, and I think so when we formalize social relations in legal institutions, we strip out all the details.
Right.
And I think I'm totally taken by your examples because you show that this is not the case. Actually, it becomes richer. And I guess we don't have a good answer to this because we don't know what happens, let's say, to the spoken language. But I'm just wondering, maybe just by looking at what has been written over time, as the language becomes standardized or hip-hop gets standardized,
Yeah.
it becomes also less exciting at some
Absolutely.
point, right?
Yeah.
So if you draw the line, beyond the 19th century and the 20th century, does Vietnamese become more like classical Chinese?
Yes,
Okay.
at 100%. Thank you for pointing that out. It's a really important point. There is a cycle to this, of course. Vernacularization occurs multiple times, and it is another way to talk about it is another good example of what I think this excellent point is describing is Marvel superhero movies. They were fresh and new and interesting, and they are definitely past their apex now. They've formalized to the point of suicide, essentially, and they're definitely on the decay, And that happens, I think, with languages, with literary forms of language. So I did draw the line at the 18th century because I think that is the moment when it's the most sort of fecund, right? It's the most fertile. And I think it's that way because in the process of translation, you're doing precisely the opposite of formalization. You're actually destroying the forms of the cosmopolitan because the vernacular is not a good fit for it. So that's what's producing these new things. But then, of course, what happens is no more code switching, the production of a new set of standards and conventions, and then you get what we now call classical Vietnamese, right? And of course, there is such a thing as classical Vietnamese, right? And then the new vernacular is what kids are speaking on the streets of Saigon today, that is the new vernacular now. So I do think that is an eternal process, and I do think you're right. The formalization is the thing that marks a kind of transition into the new status as classical, maybe. Thank you.
John, thanks very much. It's a great conversation. And I was just teasing out the many sorts of relationships you have between the two languages. Excuse me. You have the icon that vernacular is not trying to break free. The classical Chinese is a Vietnamese language.
Yeah.
That you're replacing the idea that vernacular is the power relation and talking about something else. But then you also talked about it as vernacular queering, classical Chinese, which is a different relationship between the two. You mentioned the idea of shame, that, we no longer need to be ashamed of our vernacular.
Yeah.
It's a classical language as well. And I get the sense a lot, you don't use that word, but I get a sense of play as well. That in that elaboration of the extra two syllables, there's this space of play where the classical Chinese is something I can pick up and use for my own purposes to invent something new. So I'm not dominated by it. It's a useful object for me to expand on.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there is a sense, or it seems there's a sense of power, there's a sense of queering, which is about normativity and counter-normativity. There's a sense of shame, there's a play. There seems to be a lot of different things wrapped up in that encounter. And I was just wondering, I guess I don't have a particular question, but how does this play out? Because I think it's very interesting to move away from a straight down the note power relationship of people seeking to be free to teasing out these different sorts of iterations.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because there definitely is a structure of that type. And I think the notion of play is useful. I appreciate the use of that word. And this is a little bit maybe related to Katarina's question in some senses, in terms of what is at the center and what is formalized and what is free from that, what is subversive. And I would say, one very common observation, when you look at East Asia, the scholars who have worked on diglossia, who've worked on cosmopolitan vernacular, of course the classic model is Western Europe. It's Latin and all of the vernaculars. It's the fall of Latin in the Roman Empire and the rise of the vernacular. And the second most documented case is the Sanskrit cosmopolis, where you have a very similar case. A scholar named Sheldon Pollock wrote extensively comparing the Latin and Sanskrit cosmopolises. And in both cases, you have a more straightforward pattern where the classical or cosmopolitan language erodes, and relatively quickly the vernacular replaces it. That's what happens in Western Europe in most places. You have a short period in which, maybe the Carolingians are speaking Latin, maybe they're not, maybe they're speaking Frankish, maybe they're not. It's very short though, and before you know it, Old French is there. I'm simplifying and saying, there's Latin, and then boom, there's Dante, and everyone's writing in Italian. Obviously, I'm simplifying these patterns, but by and large, that is what happens in Europe and in South Asia. But in East Asia, classical does not go away. Like, people start playing with the vernacular, but they never abandon the classical until colonization, essentially. And then that's wrapped up in nationalism, in fact. So there is people are struggling even now to sort of describe the geography of the space, because you do have so many similar things. You have a kind of subversive alternative space in the vernacular, but you also have a continuing, and it's not dead, like many people like to say. The production of classical literature is rich, varied, and beautiful, and also very inventive all the way through the 20th century. So it's not as simple as a pure complementary distribution of those two worlds. So I guess I don't have a full answer to your comment either, except to say that there's something that needs to be said about that. It's not a simple process. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I have another thought. This might be well beyond your topic here, but as we were talking a lot about form, what about content?
Yeah.
Do the stories change? How does this new written vernacular change the stories that people tell?
Well, that's the thing, and this is the most interesting part, I think, of the project, and probably the most likely to be wrong. Because it's the biggest claim. But I do think the content does change. And it changes as a result of this process of translation where the thing spellbound, the thing that's identified as the object of translation, is moving away from the meaning of the original. Because they're latching onto something else. It's this stuff of immediacy. Okay? So the classic example of this is The Tale of Q, which is considered the national poem of Vietnam. It's written in the 19th century. It's based on a Chinese novel, which is already complicated because the Chinese novel is in the Chinese vernacular, okay? But it's not treated that way in its reception in Vietnam. But the way the poem changes is it's actually an incredible example because it's going from prose fiction back into a poetic form. Nevertheless, it does the same thing I've been describing. It veers into especially the mode of psychological realism. Now, that's already present in the novel because the novelistic form has that as a hallmark. I'm not making myself clear. What I'm really suggesting is that different things of concern emerge as a result of this process of translation. And the things that I've noted in terms of content are things like psychological realism, the immediacy of the subject, visual and sensual specificity, and all of those are the hallmarks of what we varyingly call modern fiction, modern narrative. Now, this doesn't always happen at the same time. Originally, I had a slide called The Century and the Moment because I had two thoughts. One, there's something weird going on about the 18th century because it's happening everywhere. It's the apex of Mingqing vernacular novel in China. It's also the rise of the sentimental novel in England. It's the beginning of the Romantic movement in France and Europe. And of course, we have the flourishing of this type of thing here, all revolving around the same types of things. Something's happening, but also, so it could be something specific to that time period that is inflecting the mode of translation towards these things. But then there's also just the relative trajectory of literature. So you can look at a counterexample like The Tale of Genji, which is a novel written in 12th century Japan that has incredibly rich psychological realism. And you think that as a counterexample to this very what's the word I'm looking for? Don't count your chickens before they're hatched idea. I would argue that it's not a counterexample because if you look at The Tale of Genji, there's a whole history of a couple centuries of translation from classical to Japanese that precede that novel. So I think and what I would love to do is sit down with bunches of people who are looking at the beginning of what we call varyingly modern novels that focus on sentiment, that focus on psychological reality, that are rich with dialogue, interrupted speech, and things like this, and look at the literary history before them. Is there a role of some kind of translation that's driving that? And I would say probably, yes, there is. One last example in that case, the rise of vernacular novels in China. Also translation from classical to Baihua, to the vernacular. So there's a conspiracy. Even if it's not the 18th century all the time, there's a conspiracy of the movement of that content in all of these cases.
Thank you very much, John. As you know, I'm a sinologist, and I always somehow draw the comparison to the Chinese case and the Chinese vernacular and its relationship to the classical style, literary Chinese, as we also call it. And I wonder, like, what the relationship was in the case of Vietnam, in terms of literacy, you know, because I guess literacy, first of all, also in Vietnam meant being able to read the classical Chinese text. Absolutely. So how about like Vietnamese vernacular literacy? Where was it acquired? Because I mean, we have this same lacuna somehow for China. Where was like vernacular literacy acquired? We imagine Chinese schools not to have taught vernacular Chinese, of course.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So first, thank you, Roland, for using the more correct term, literary Chinese. I did use classical Chinese. Classical Chinese specifically refers to actual classical Chinese from the classical period in the Zhou. So that's not a correct term. Literary Chinese is better for the language as it is written after the medieval period. And I personally prefer literary Sinitic because it's doesn't get into that sort of nationalist trap. So that's an aside, but thank you, Roland. That's a good question. So we don't have very many indications. There are two lines of evidence for this. First, all the earliest forms of all vernacular writing is pedagogical, to learn the classical. So that means, it doesn't necessarily mean that you knew Nome before you knew classical. It means that you are a speaker of Vietnamese. Because actually, if you're a speaker of Vietnamese and you're learning to write Chinese, then basically, by default, you know Nome, right? It's like, maybe you never wrote Spanish before, but you know how you're learning to read French, and you're a speaker of Spanish. Well, it's not hard to then to start writing out words in Spanish using the Roman alphabet. So the earliest texts we have are texts of that type. So the script itself developed as a tool to learn classical. Now, where was it taught? We have, by the 14th century, two historical accounts of tutors who are tutoring princesses in the capital. They use vernacular poems to seduce the princesses. So that means that by this point, there was some kind of common command of Nome among the elites. And it probably was, again, in my opinion, a kind of ad hoc acquisition because you spoke Vietnamese at this point, and you knew a few characters, so you could write out a sentence in Vietnamese using Nome. So you could write out a ditty, right? So when we have these examples of literacy, these historical references to literacy in Nome before mastery of classical, I think that's what they are. But by and large, the authors of these works that we're talking about now, these are people who are masters of classical Chinese. They are already fluent in classical, and then they turn to the vernacular. And never, as far as I know, was vernacular ever systematically taught. It's not even systematized as a script. Virtually every text of the vernacular uses a different inventory of characters, right? So it never gains that type of thing, you know. The last thing I'll say on this score is that, you know, one should not underestimate the force of the spoken language. If it's the spoken language, then inevitably, because of practical reasons, a lot of people are going to be able to write. And you just need to be a little bit more careful about what you imagine that they're literate in. Literacy could mean 20 characters, you know, for this merchant who all he needs to know how to write is, you know, 3 types of rice wine and a price. You know, then he's literate in vernacular Vietnamese to a certain extent. And then maybe there's this princess who is learning classical and she knows enough maybe to write a little bit, a story here and there, you know. And then there are these great literary figures who are masters of classical, who then are also subsequently, you know, experimenting with the vernacular. So that's not a satisfying answer, but it's an excellent question. Thank you.
I think we can end on this. Thank you,
Thank you so
John.
much.